As Mr. Mallinson wisely suggests, persistent and integrated engagement offers the possibility for deeper understanding of the battle space. And that has a lot of implications for intelligence. As General McMaster said, that doesn't necessarily equate to targeting, and I think that's a really important issue to think of as we go on. Today's threats obviously call more than ever for all instruments of state power to be working in concert. And again, maybe uncomfortably, I might suggest that that might require the military to get outside of its comfortable kinetic lane sometimes. And that's an uncomfortable thing to think about, both for the military and, frankly, for civilians that are interacting with the military. I think some of this, as obviously these panels are slopping a little bit over each other's topics, I might be talking about some of the pitfalls of persistent engagement with foreign partners, but those pitfalls can also turn into threats. Prime Minister Cameron has refocused our attention on violent extremism, which he just, I think yesterday, called an ideological as much as a security threat. And as we heard this morning, a number of you are still quite worried about the eastern edges of Europe. And then, of course, there's a Syrian civil war and a melted down Libya. These disparate crises in a multipolar world, I'd like to suggest that the thread linking them is central to this issue of integrated and persistent engagement. And that thread has to do with the quality of governance in the places where these threats are arising. And like the other Yanks in the room, I am the product, or our country is the product of a violent insurrection. So it always sort of amuses me to see us in the position of the redcoats these days. We seem to have surprisingly little sympathy for people who are engaged in violent insurrection at the moment. And again, at the risk of being overly provocative, I'm going to suggest that as hard as it is to swallow, there is a moral and social justice element to a lot of the security threats that we're seeing, be they anti-corruption revolutions across the Arab world and into Ukraine, or even be they violent extremism. Just to touch on Tunisia, the Ben Ali regime organized the tourism industry in Tunisia around its kleptocratic networks. In order to have a hotel, you basically had to be part of the kleptocratic network. That hotel was entirely cut off from the Tunisian culture or economy. People there cavorted on beaches, sometimes in bathing suits, but there was certainly also a degree of sex tourism that went on in the Tunisian tourist industry. I'm not saying that's that excuses the execution of tourists in Tunisia. I'm just saying that a better understanding of the environment in which we're operating, either as tourists or as the military, is absolutely critical to getting this right. Another example here, I was recently in Nigeria and just talking through with a number of legal professionals, how does corruption work in the judicial system? And I was getting the mechanisms of it, how such and such a judge doesn't actually take the money himself. He's got an agent in the market, but everybody knows if you want a decision from that judge, you go to this agent. Someone stopped and said, Sarah, a prosecutor, he said, you're focused on money. It's not just about money. And here I am, a female, not having thought of this. He said, there was a gentleman recently in pretrial detention. He was ill. His wife goes to the judge, begs the judge, please please release him on bail. I promise he'll come back for trial. The judge took advantage of her, which troubles me significantly as a female. As a security analyst, I'm thinking about her brother. I'm thinking, what does the brother want to do to the judge? He wants to kill him. And in northern Nigeria, it's not hard. Right about there is somebody who wants that man to kill the judge. The opportunity for reacting to the humiliation that is part and parcel of the type of corruption that is visited on the populations by many of the countries with which we are partnering, very readily leads to violence. It leads to violence because indignant people become violent often. It leads to violence because there's an opportunity. But there's also an argument, which is to say the reason that judge behaved in such a corrupt, in all senses of the term, fashion, and the reason the tourist industry is the way it looks in Tunisia today is because our government is not organized according to God's law. It's because that hotel owner or that judge doesn't obey God's law. And again, just to make sure that we remember this isn't just Muslims and it's not just the 21st century, a good friend of the Anglo-Americans in the room is John Locke, a political theorist of the, just to touch on some history, right, of the 17th century, who said, when there is a barefaced wresting of the law to indemnify a man or a party of men, war is made on the sufferers, who, lacking an appeal on earth to help them, will turn to the only remedy in such cases, an appeal to heaven. So he's basically, and that was a Puritan who was the product of a violent religious extremist revolution against King Charles I and the Catholic Church. So again, not to try to say that things are identical, but we ought to just remember that there are some parallels in these types of human reactions to acute abuse of power. And so the implications of this very brief and sketchy analysis include that it really matters what kind of government you partner with in your effort to combat some of these threats. Means you need to know something about how that government operates. Now, I'm aware that these types of partnerships are usually decided on a political level rather than a military level. But as senior officers, it's also your duty, I would submit, to challenge when the occasion arises whether certain alliances really are likely to further the national interest. And on a more operational level, I would say the implications are really significant for intelligence. And that's where persistent engagement comes back in. But as was suggested earlier, the right kind of persistent engagement. That means interacting with populations without government intermediaries, screening or shaping what the populations say. And it means also, quite frankly, again, a bit uncomfortable both on the civilian and the military side, it means conducting network analysis on our friends as well as our enemies. And in fact, it might mean breaking down some of the barriers between those categories. We in the West have a tendency to see basically two categories of licit actors, and those are governments and the private sector, and we all disagree about the degree to which the government or the private sector may or may not be acting in the public interest, but fundamentally, we believe that those are licit actors. And then the illicit actors are criminals and occasionally terrorists and things like that. Very often, in the types of countries we're talking about, Ben Ali's Tunisia, Mubarak's Egypt, Jonathan's Nigeria, Karzai's Afghanistan, and I can go on and on, Karimov's Uzbekistan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we are actually dealing with horizontally integrated networks in which government officials, members of the private sector, criminals and occasionally insurgents are wired in to the same network, and they need to be studied as networks, and those networks are often vertically integrated as well, so that the cop who's shaking you down on the street is actually kicking up a portion of those revenues all the way up to the top. And so things that we have a tendency to brush aside as petty aren't actually so petty. And what that means, finally, on partnering is that, again, the choice of partners is critical. At the strategic level, what governments are we partnering with? Is an Arab an Arab? Oh, it's great to get Arabs into the anti-ISIS coalition. Well, isn't it interesting that most of ISIS's or Al-Qaeda's targets or their enemies were Arabs? So let's make some distinctions between Arabs and Arabs. Anyway, choices of government, but that means, again, even on an operational level, choice of what officers you are partnering with and a willingness to say, no, this officer's behavior is unacceptable and we can no longer prosecute our mission effectively if we are seen to be partnering with this officer. And it means that partnering and capacity building can't be reduced just to fires and maneuver. It really also has to be about how does a military function as a respectful arm of a legitimate government. Thank you very much.